Hello, writers. I have got Andrew Wall with me here. Hello, Andrew.
Hello,
And I am
Sarah. How are
so
you?
excited to talk to Andrew because we're going to dig into some world building stuff, which is not at all my area of expertise, but it is 100% Andrew's area of expertise. So this is going to be a great conversation. But for our writers who don't know Andrew, let me just give you a little bit more info here. Andrew is a book coach and world building consultant at Craft Better Books, the company he runs with his business partner and spouse, Katie, which I'm sure could be a whole different conversation
Yes.
about how that all works. But as a coach who specializes in world building, he enjoys working with people of all genres because, yes, all stories and genres need world building to ensure that their story worlds feel truly alive and immersive. He is formally trained in philosophy, theology, history, anthropology, and education, all subjects that are extremely helpful when coming to support writers in their world building endeavors. And when he is not working on stories and worlds, he enjoys playing TTRPGs with his friends, exploring virtual worlds in video games, playing board games with his spouse, and wrapping himself in a warm blanket on a rainy day to read. And being the monster villain that his kids attack as they pretend to be heroes of various sorts. Sounds like we have a lot of similar things happening in our household as your household.
I believe it.
All right, so let's dive into this world building. But because I don't want to leave anybody behind, we might have newer writers and more experienced writers here with us. Maybe could you just give us like what do we mean when we say world building?
So people mean a lot of different things when they say world building. If the second you start researching world building in Google, you'll very quickly come to realize this. Um, I define world building in a very specific way, and I'm going to get to that in a second. I just want to a lot of people sometimes think world building is just developing a setting
Hmm.
for the book. In other words, to use a crude theater analogy, developing the props and set pieces. Um, that's not what world building is. I have a huge preoccupation of shooting down that approach to world building because if your world building runs as only as deep as your scenes, your world is not going to the story world is not going to feel alive. It's not going to feel lived in. It's not going to feel three-dimensional. It's going to feel
Yeah,
like cardboard set pieces.
yeah,
So this is why world building is so important. You want to create that immersive experience for your readers where they get in and it feels real and logical and interconnected and a lot bigger than what they are seeing. That's a big part of it. Okay, so what's my actual definition of world building? I define world building as the process of generating the various pieces of your world and defining the relationships between them in a logical and systematic way that creates the experience of a living, breathing world overflowing with story potential. If the only story that your world can tell is the story that you are choosing to write, you've done your world building incorrectly.
I love that.
it's
That
it's
that's
too
that's
small.
actually a very fantastic what do we want to call it? Like a filter. Like
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
really well said.
there
Yeah.
should be lots of, I mean, obviously the story that you have chosen to write is what you are, the story you are interested in telling, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you could say like, well, I could also tell this story over here, or this story over here, or this story over here. And you can, there should be a lot of, for creating a sandbox, you want to have a lot of room to play in your world. Because there's nothing you can, okay, so you can tell a world is small. I'm going to give a fantasy example. You can tell a world is small when um, a book ends and it's like, satisfying arc, and then the next book starts and the conflict feels out of left field. It doesn't feel connected. It doesn't feel organic. It feels kind of like, what? What, but where, but why? There needs like worlds are, you can understand the cause and effect relationships between everything. And it's like, okay, so if these events in this book happen this way, it should set up what's going to be happening in the next book. It shouldn't be a non sequitur.
Yeah.
But anyway, as I said, I can jabber about this nonstop for probably about 3 hours. So I'm going to pause for a moment so you can redirect the
Well,
conversation.
I love that you've pointed out that it's important. Like, I think that we tend to think of world building specifically in the speculative fiction
Mhm.
genres because it's those stories take place in worlds that are not our own.
Yeah,
But as you have mentioned, world building really does matter for every genre.
yeah,
So do you find that to be a common problem, perhaps, with writers who are not writing, fantasy, sci-fi, like that they maybe
yeah,
haven't done enough?
yes. So you're right. Fantasy, speculative fiction in general, so fantasy, sci-fi, anything with spec fic elements, um, is what people think of when they think
Yeah.
of world building. Because you have to figure out the pieces of the world you have to develop all of them.
Yes.
um, with more realistic fiction, like romance or contemporary fiction or women's fiction, um, the world building is less obvious. The world building that needs to be done. Um, I'll give an example of a holiday romance. This will take place in, big city person going home to the small town. Um, and it's so easy because it's such a familiar trope to kind of phone it in
Yep.
on actually developing the town. But you need to know the layout of the town so you don't contradict yourself when you're describing where they're going. You need to know what memories different places in the town are going to trigger for your character,
Right.
and why those places are significant, and maybe complicated, contradictory emotions that they feel in reaction to them when they walk into their childhood home. Is it the same as when they grew up? Is it different? These are going to cause different emotional reactions. Where's the picture of our family that's been hanging on this wall forever? Why is it in the closet now? But again, so world building ends up zooming way farther into the details. This isn't to say that fantasy world builders shouldn't do some of this world building.
Yes.
But it is to say that in realistic fiction, it becomes way more important, because the emotions of your character and of real people are tied to things and places and people. And you have to be able to understand all of that. I'm going to say something controversial before you start writing. Because if you try to define those things as you write, you're going to have to go back and rewrite your book, because you're going to end up doing things that either contradict things you did earlier, or should have been mentioned earlier. If you just like make up like a thing that they found on a shelf. Well, if that's going to have a lot of significance to them and they've hypothetically been in that same room earlier in the book, you're going to have to mention it earlier, even if you don't go into the same level of depth and in interaction with it. So, these kinds of things, there's a lot of layering that happens when it comes to the details with world building for non-spec fic stuff. Sure, you don't have to develop political systems or the economics or the cultures, because that's all kind of there.
Yep.
You're stepping into a pre-lived in world
Yeah.
in a lot of ways, but you have to pay a lot more attention to your character's world, if that
Yeah.
makes any sense.
It does make a lot of sense. And, I'm someone who comes from academia, spent many
Mhm.
years in academia. And lately my biggest pet peeve is these romance stories that are taking place in academia. And I'm like,
That's not
that's
what it's like. Yeah, yeah.
not it at all.
Where are the board meetings? We need more board meetings. No, uh-huh.
Yeah, yeah. Oh my goodness. Okay, so some stories So we've established that all stories should spend some time with world building, but perhaps some might require a little more world building than others. So it's like a spectrum probably for every
Yeah.
aspect of writing. And I mean, what do you see as being like the bare minimum, the minimum viable product of a believable world here?
Uh-huh. Um, I both love and hate this question. One, one because I love it because I get a chance to answer it, and I hate it because because it is the question that I get asked most often. So what's like the least amount of this that I need to do?
Well, I've told you world building is not my thing, so I need to know
Yeah,
the minimum amount of work I can do, Andrew.
yeah, no, I totally understand, and I'll go out on a limb. World building's actually not what is not in like the thing for most people that I work with. That's not to say that there aren't some that really enjoy and get really into it, but there are some that it feels like more of a slog.
Mhm.
It's just harder. It's not something that comes naturally. And I just want to say that's okay. It doesn't have to be your wheelhouse. It's okay if your wheelhouse is at the line level. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Um, to circle back around to your question though, the bare minimum that you have to do. Um, I think you just have to ask yourself, does this feel lived in? Does it feel complex? Does it feel like it's bigger than what is on the page? And different people will draw the line in different places. Like, I think this is enough. And they may discover as they're writing, that wasn't enough. um, but if you're ever writing, and I'm going to speak especially to fancy people here, if you're ever writing your book and you're not sure what's going to happen next, that's a world building problem.
Mm.
Um, that means you didn't do enough. It should the cause and effect in your relationships in your world. You should know what's going to happen if X happens. Y is probably going to be the result. It shouldn't require you to reinvent the wheel to write the next scene. That means that you didn't do enough world building. So
Yeah.
I always push people, make it as complete as possible. Um, it's more, and this is the trap, right? More details never a bad thing. He says to, I'm sure some of you out there who have your giant folders full of folders full of folders full of documents, that is your world building Bible in a Google Drive somewhere or something like that. Uh, I get it. I'm like you.
Yeah.
It's a fractal process. It goes on forever. Um, but it's you know, do what you need to do. A good rule of thumb is at the very least, you want anywhere and any place that your story is going to touch, anything, any person, anything, develop it as much as possible.
Yeah. Okay, so let's look at the flip side of this though, which you've kind of alluded to with the big binders and the Bibles and all of these things, because we totally know that writers will go overboard. It's almost like an avoidance. Like if I just keep doing
It
this,
can
then
be.
I don't have to actually because writing the story is also difficult. And
Yes.
sometimes it can be like a procrastination that looks like working, but is actually really just maybe procrastination. So like when do you push writers out the door and be like, like you've done enough here. Now you need to
Yeah.
actually put it into practice.
I'm always hesitant to push people out of there without a good
Mm-hmm.
understanding of them
Mm-hmm.
and what it is they want and what it is they're trying to do. Um, so I don't think that I'm going to be able to give a nice, easy answer
Sure,
for this
sure.
one. Um, for example, Tolkien spent 50 plus years doing his world building. before really actually writing anything. So, there's something to be said with that. Some people are going to be on that end of the spectrum, and some people aren't. um, However, I think some of the reasons why writers get hung up with world building is a kind of a procrastination, because writing feels almost like a bigger commitment. It's real, and this is the part where if it's bad, it matters.
People are
Right?
going to see it. People are like
Right.
actually going to
Yeah.
read what I'm writing.
Yeah, exactly. Uh, and Patrick, I don't know if you've read Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss at all. What great book, great series. Not done yet. We're angry about it, but go read it if you haven't read it. It's some of the best world building. He was interviewed on world building and asked what's a good rule of thumb of how much of your world building should end up in your book. And he's like, I think a good rule of thumb is 10%. For me, it's about 3%. So, again, world building, you should do a lot of world building. That's what's going to make your world feel alive. You're going to know that you have a problem with world building, though. And by problem, I mean like an addiction.
Yeah.
Difficulty moving past it. If you're feeling anxious about defining the story you are going to tell in that world, that's when you might have an avoidance problem. If you have all the folders, all the detail and everything, but you're uncertain what you want to commit to, that's a possible sign that maybe you should work with a book coach to help you define that better. On the other hand, you're going to have folks that know what they want, the story that they want to tell, but it means so much to them to get it right, that they're avoiding starting that perfectionism bit. And for those writers, I just want to say your first draft is going to be bad.
I know, but it's still so hard to like.
I know.
I know what you're saying, but I don't know if I truly believe what you're saying, right?
Yeah. I think the little dirty secret, for a lot of beginning writers especially don't know, is that the magic of writing happens in revision.
Yeah.
You got to just get the first draft out. It can be real dirty, real rough. Even if you're just writing narrative summary and you know that you're going to have to go and attack in and put in a lot more dialogue, like just get it out. Because it's in revision that you really start shaping it into what you want. But we're going off track with that. We're not talking about revision.
No, but it's still an interesting question, because I would assume that with revision, like anything, when you go through revision, it's like you develop the character more. I assume, go through more world building potentially, because maybe now you've figured out places where you didn't know as much as you thought you needed, or you need to weave it in more or take some of it out.
Right. Well, and that's possible for sure. I do want to say that of the people that I have done world building audits for, who have already written a manuscript of various draft stages, almost all of them have ended up having to rewrite their stories from scratch after revising world building.
Yeah.
Because world building is one of those, it's foundational. It's the foundation you're building on. And so any big changes that you make down here are going to have massive ripple effects in the rest of your story. So you need to be, and again, that's even true in realistic fiction. If you're going to change the setting of an important memory, that's going to have really big implications for some scenes later on, in your story that may or may not be happening in that location, and whether it's invoking the same feelings or not. Like that stuff matters, and changing that has huge ramifications. So you just need to be careful. Trying to do too much world building.
I can
if
totally
you
see that.
find a hole, go fill the hole, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, be careful.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you mentioned earlier the example of like the big city to the small town, and I've
Mhm,
lived in both Southern Florida and Michigan, very different places, and I can
mhm.
honestly tell you that Miami is very different from Detroit. So
Oh,
if my big
yeah.
city person was going to move from one location to the other, I can totally see where that would impact a lot.
Yeah, I mean, just like the cultures that are like
Mhm.
what kind of food can you find if you walk out of your apartment building? That's really important in a
Yeah.
big city scenario. I mean, like, and it matters. It's going to communicate a lot about not just about it's going to communicate a lot about the place that you're in, about the kind of neighborhood in the city that you're in. That's the kind of building cities is almost like micro world building because you have all these different
Yep.
neighborhoods that have their own kind of cultures.
Yep.
um, and vibes and levels of development and decay and all of that, socioeconomics. I mean, like all of that plays such a huge role um, in our actual world. We do ourselves a disservice to pretend that it doesn't in our stories.
Yeah. Well, writers, we have only scratched the surface here. Um, uh, but hopefully we have convinced the writers here that world building is important, regardless of what genre we are writing in. And Andrew is an expert in this. I am not. And so if you are looking for help with world building, Andrew is your guy here. How can people connect with you?
I'd say the best way to connect with me, just go to our website, craftbetterbooks.com. And if you think you need world building support, schedule a free consultation.
Yep.
It's pretty
And you
easy.
also have a bunch of like world building resources and things as well. Do you not on your website, like people can
Yeah, so we have a couple of freebies,
Mhm.
um as well as I have a course that I am in the process of redoing.
Oh, there we go.
um it's currently 1 month, 1 month world building. It's geared almost exclusively towards fantasy, sci-fi, spec fic. um I am in the process of redoing it to where it's going to be world building made simple. Is going to be the replacement course. It'll be a little more in depth and such like that. But
Cool. Very cool. Writers will have links to all of that stuff so that you can find it easily in the show notes. But Andrew, thank you so much for your time in this conversation because it's always great to learn from people who know lots more things about things I know nothing about.
it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Sarah.
Writers, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Bye.